Hello everyone, a very warm welcome. We have a session tonight with Bill Jacox on skills and qualities of an effective team coach. And it's my privilege to host this session. I'm Mary Hartog, and I'm a volunteer with the EMCC, and my role is Global Group Work Lead for Team Coaching, which I took over from Colm Murphy, who I see is on the call. So hi there, Colm. It's very timely because EMCC have responded to the growing interest and demand for team coaching. And what we've done, Colm will probably chip in during the session to tell about this as well. We have created 12 core standards for team coaching, and we're currently working behind the scenes with the performance indicators that sit behind those standards. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Bill Jacox from the USA, who is leading tonight's session. Bill is the director of the Alameda County Training and Education Center, working with public sector organizations in organization development, leadership development, and of course, team coaching. And these would be organizations such as fire, healthcare, and probation services. About 6 years ago, Bill tells me, he completed his PhD on team coaching, and it's in part from that work tonight that he will share with us his thoughts on quality of a team coach. He also is a contributor to the Practitioner Handbook of Team Coaching, which David Clutterbuck and Judy Gannon are editors for, with some other colleagues from EMCC. So do look out for Bill's chapter in that handbook. It's chapter 25, if you have it. And that's published by Routledge in the UK. I'm going to hand over to Bill, and I know that we're in for an interactive session. So the floor is yours, Bill, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mary, and for Nicola, and thanks for all of you for being here. I'm sort of honored and delighted to sort of kick off, if you will, these series of dialogues. And I know from my perspective, you know, we've seen, you know, as Mary mentioned, you know, I did this dissertation research 6 years ago, and the team coaching space has just, I mean, it's unbelievable how much it's grown. I mean, when I was doing my research 6 years ago, there wasn't, you know, standards or competencies or programs where you could get a certificate or some sort of a credential in team coaching. And now all of that exists, and it's pretty exciting. My guess is that many of you, if not most of you, are here because in some way you're interested in either yourself becoming, if you will, a better team coach, or continuing down your sort of development path of team coaching, or maybe you're involved in influencing others to help in their path of becoming a better team coach, as we all sort of collectively sort of in the moment experience this growth of this kind of an industry, if you will, where there seems to be a growing need for it. So it's very exciting. It's cool to be a part of it and to be part of the process of exploring this kind of new world in a way. And so my hope for today is that we get to enter into some dialogue with one another that might help us help others sort of continue down whatever that pathway is for you. So as Mary had mentioned, you know, I work in the public sector now. I've worked in the private sector. I've worked in public universities. I've worked in the nonprofit agencies. And so I've kind of been all over the place. But one of the things that has been consistent throughout is this interest in and working with teams. And so that really sort of led me to the desire to do some deeper research, the desire to sort of pursue a PhD, and then a desire to ultimately do a dissertation around team coaching and exploring sort of what that thing was that I was at least 6 years ago was sort of tangentially hearing about when I was doing my research on teams, just real briefly, one of the things that came up over and over again when I was researching teams and what makes teams great is, it seemed the consensus was that teams that are doing the best work have good team coaches. So then I started thinking, okay, well, great, but who are these team coaches? And then it was then that I was sort of not really finding any information. So I was then, okay, great, this might be an opportunity for me to contribute to the knowledge and to the research. So let me just quickly, briefly sort of talk about what was the research that I did. So, the title of this workshop was essentially the question that I was trying to answer in doing this research. And the process that I used to get to those answers were using a method called the Delphi method, which is essentially a method where I more or less find a bunch of team coaches out there in the world. And in my case, I found 20 team coaches from 4 different countries, trying to get as much diversity as I could, and basically asked them, if I were to ask you what are the top 5, or not even the top 5, what are the top qualities and skills, and I would define for them what those mean, what would you just come up with based on your own experience? So these folks sort of wrote down what they thought, emailed it back to me. I sort of crunched all that together, which sort of became the basis of the survey that I would then send back out saying, hey folks, here's what you wrote down, but here's what everyone else wrote down as well. And here's this sort of larger list now of qualities and skills. Take a look at that list, which now has more things on there than maybe what you wrote down, and look and start to prioritize these things, start to put them in an order. One of the things about the Delphi method that is, I think, interesting is that it's iterative and it's also anonymous. So the anonymous piece is, none of these people knew who else. I was the only one that knew who was participating in this study. The reason why that's important is it eliminates the opportunity to be influenced by somebody else. So for example, if I know that I'm putting ideas out there, but I also know that somebody else who is my hero in team coaching or is my supervisor or somebody that I believe has a lot more knowledge than I do, put some things down, if I can attribute those to them, then it might influence my own decision. So it's anonymous in that way. The iterative piece is that I just keep sending out this information, or basically the data that's being collected. I crunch it, I start to prioritize it. Basically what we're trying to get to is a consensus. Okay, group of 20 folks, 20 team coaches. We're gonna keep doing this until you all agree that this is the correct, not only are these the correct qualities from your experience as a team coach and the correct skills from your experience as a team coach, but they're in the correct order as well. So they're ordered in priority as well. So we just did that over and over again, like 4 or 5 or 6 times until we sort of got to that consensus. So when we look at the results of the research, it's 15 qualities and 11 skills, or I think it's 14 and 11 skills, but they actually are in a specific order. And so that's important. So one of the things that what I want to do with you all today is, okay, so this was research that was done 6 years ago. Does it still make sense, right? Based on my experience as a team coach, do these things still make sense? And now it's kind of exciting because we can also look to, the standards that the EMCC has just put out. The ICF has just put down a bunch of competencies. So we have different ways that we can look at what do I need to do to make sure that I'm sort of checking all the boxes to become the best team coach that I can be. The research that I did is just one of those things, but I think if you look at all of those things collectively, I think it can start pointing you in a direction of the areas that, as an individual that's trying to improve my own team coaching, I can look at a variety of sort of sources now and say, okay, I'm going to focus on this area, or I want to focus on this area, or given what I'm already strong in, maybe here are some areas that I want to improve on for myself to make myself a better team coach. And so today I'm excited to sort of, have all of you together to ultimately look at, these qualities and these skills, and to not only just say, yay, those still seem to make sense, but really, fine, let's just say that they make sense. How does one use that information? If I'm an aspiring team coach or a team coach that wants to just get better, wherever I'm at on the spectrum, how can I use any of this information? What can I actually physically do or specifically do? Or if I'm advising or mentoring somebody who's also an aspiring team coach, and they say to me, hey, Bill, like, I think I've identified that I really need to work on, you know, facilitating groups well. I've identified that as an area of growth for me. How do I do that? Like, what's your recommendation or what's your advice on and how I might specifically be able to do that? And so one of the things that I'm hoping in this group and today is, hey, let's get into some groups. Eventually we'll do that. Let's get into some groups and let's pick one or two of these qualities or skills and come up with some, like a strategy almost. Hey, here's how I would advise somebody else that they could, specific steps that they could do if they're trying to improve that aspect of their team coaching, which again is an area that was identified by at least some people as important. One of the things that I started to do recently is looking at the standards and the you know, the different standards that are out there now, is looking at them and seeing, hey, are any of the things that my research came up with, are any of those things in common? And I started to see some overlap there, which kind of makes sense, of course. So Nicola, could you bring up the first slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so great. So, you know, I'd mentioned before, there's more than 5 qualities that came out of the research, but I just wanted to put up the top 5 for today's workshop. And again, we identified, well, at the top there, it's, you know, we clarified and identified what a quality is and how that might be distinguished from a skill. But, you know, the way that I think about it is generally a quality is something that's sort of maybe internal, like your character or something like that. And a skill is maybe something that you could learn in a class or, you know, get some coaching on and learn as well. So arguably a quality is something that might maybe take a little bit more time, or it's a little bit more difficult, if you will, to develop in oneself, right? It might take a bigger commitment for yourself. So, oh, and by the way, another aspect of the study that I did, because you'll notice that under each of those 5 qualities, there's kind of a little snippet, maybe what looks like a quote or something, and that's exactly what it is. So once I got all the results back, once I did that iterative process and got sort of this consensus of the qualities and the skills based on, you know, what these particular team coaches had to say at the time, I then followed up and did kind of like a group call afterwards. And again, that was anonymous as well. And said, hey, okay, so here's what you all came up with. Here's what you all decided was most important in the order of importance. Tell me a little bit more about how that shows up, or what does that look like, or why that's important sort of in your own team coaching practice. And so I got a lot of rich data in terms of kind of qualitative information from those follow-up calls. And what I've listed on that slide is just a little bit of a sort of a snippet, if you will, of, you know, of a quote that might describe a little bit more of what they were thinking or why they were thinking that that was important. So, and if you look at these qualities, right, so, you know, number 1 is are aware of themselves and their impact on others. Number 2, are attuned to environment and self, and so on. What I want to ask you all to do is well, in a moment, we're going to break you up into small groups. And in those small groups, what I want to invite you to do, and I don't think this slide will be visible. So if you need to take like a little photo or something like that, because what I'm going to ask you to do in those small groups, and the small groups will be about 10 minutes long. So try not to spend too much time introducing yourself to your other small group members, although I know that's important as well. What I'd like you to do is, in your small group, come to a consensus, if you will. Pick out one of these top 5 qualities, and I want you to pick them out, and I want you to discuss in your small group, okay, let me imagine a scenario where either I have identified this as for myself as an area of development that I want to place specific or particular emphasis on in my own development in the next several months or whatever, or somebody that I mentor or somebody that I influence has come to me and said, hey, I want to improve my team coaching, and I've identified, for whatever reason, you know, being attuned to the environment and to myself as an area that I want to develop. Do you have any advice on how I might go about doing that? Do you have any suggestions on how I might go about doing that? And so that's what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment when we get into the small group, is pick one, see if you can come up with some practical advice or some practical suggestions of how does somebody go about developing that in themselves, one of these qualities. Now, when you're doing that, we did some experimentation with the Zoom capability before you all joined in, and we want you in those small groups to take notes, or somebody to take notes. When we come back, but not in the chat, because we figured out that it doesn't translate to the large group again. So maybe open up a Word document. Somebody can be identified in your small group to like take some notes or to write some thoughts down based on your conversation, because we want to capture the richness of that conversation. When we come back from the small group, so in other words, when you're back in the large group, either cut and paste or enter into the large group chat. Maybe you know, what are some of those suggestions? Maybe right at the top, like, hey, we chose, you know, number 2 or number 3, or you can even write out the whole quality. And here are some of the bullet pointed suggestions that we have of how somebody might develop those in themselves, or advice that they might have for others. And so that way, when we come back, you know, we see those in the chat, and then I can look at those and maybe call out or call on a particular group to, you know, if it's like, hey, like, that's a great idea. Tell us a little bit more about that. Tell us a little bit more about that in the large group. Well, hopefully, well, you know what, like, enter into the chat anything that hopefully you're able to get to something, like something that is like, okay, great, we chose this particular quality, and here's at least one thing, or at least a start of a thing, of some advice or a strategy that someone might be able to take on. Yeah.
We chose the first question, being aware of ourselves and the impact on others. And it was interesting, and quite a wide spread of different things that we talked about and came up with there, which ranged from being in therapy, which, although not aimed at coaching, can bring a tight focus on self-awareness in a particular aspect, and using that experience to broaden out to increase one's self-awareness.
Okay.
Second point was triggers, understanding what triggers us to, and to try not to make assumptions about that, with positive intent, listening to understand rather than to respond, and finally, emotional intelligence. So I particularly use a psychometric called Emotions and Behaviors in Work, which has a lot of information in there about self-awareness, which is brilliant when you're talking to your client, but you can use it on yourself as well, as I have done over the years.
Great, thanks, Phil. And others, I would invite you. It looks like Colm, thanks for putting some notes in the chat, and that, you know, and even what Phil just said right there, if, you know, if somebody from that group perhaps wants to capture that in the chat, that way, you know, these great thoughts and these ideas are sort of codified and can be brought back up at a later date. You know, it's interesting, you know, you mentioned a lot of things there, but like emotional intelligence might be something that somebody could theoretically, you know, read a book or take a class or something like that to increase their emotional intelligence. Not that that's the only thing that can happen, but, you know, there's a variety of specific steps that, again, might not seem direct, but will lead to, in perhaps concert, will lead to somebody increasing that quality over time, for example. I see that you have you know, to help an ongoing coach work with 2 coaches or multiple advice sources. And I know that that's one of the, at least I believe that that's one of the standards the EMCC just put out, and what has been described as a, if not best practice, then a good practice to have 2 coaches working with a team, just because of the complexity of it all, and be able to get those different perspectives as well. Great, thank you.
I think that's really right, Bill. There are a couple of things I picked up through the chat and the comments that we've heard about around self-awareness, because that's fairly central to the standards. Clearly, reflection and supervision, key to that. One space in which you can learn and learn more about yourself and your triggers. I noticed with Colm and someone else, they had put up some ideas using things like the drama triangle. So beginning, to see those different roles that people often take up, often in conflict situations, and you talked about complexity that you certainly find in group dynamics. So there's a case there for knowing your models and your tools and knowing which one help you explain what's going on in the room, diffuse the situation. And of course, there we had that lovely suggestion about partnering with another coach. And again, back in complexity terms, that idea of, working perhaps with multiple stakeholders, people who are in different places, different states of readiness to learn, that ability to work alongside another coach. Because it is very exhausting, as you know. It's great to have another perspective to bring that diversity in, and to also pace yourself if you're working with a team. So some great things we're hearing so far, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And thanks everybody. And I'm conscious of the time, so I want to, although we don't want to, but I want to move on to the skills that came out of the research that I had done. So Nicola, if we could get that next slide up. So again, in the research, we distinguish quality from skill. There's the definition that we used for skill. And here's the top 4. Now, with these, it's fairly obvious that, a question that oftentimes comes up around team coaching is, well, what's the difference between team coaching and coaching individuals? And does somebody need to be an individual coach or a good individual coach to be a good team coach? I mean, these are all great questions. I don't have a clear answer to those. But when I was asking the team coaches that I interviewed for my research, in terms of skills, what are the things that are the most important? You can see in the top 1 and number 2, certainly those 2, I mean, those are pretty specific to dealing with teams of folks, right? Pretty important to be able to do that as a team coach. That might be something that distinguishes somebody who's a really good coach of individuals to somebody that can be effective working with teams, is whether they can facilitate groups well or whether they have a clear and deep understanding of group dynamics. So in this next small group, which, fair warning, it'll probably be shorter than you want it to be, similar process. So looking at these top 4 skills, again, I want you as a small group, just pick one and decide which one you all want to focus on. And again, we're thinking of, great, if somebody, either for my own development or as advice to somebody else, if they said, hey, Bill, like, I'm an aspiring team coach. The area that I've identified that I need some growth is facilitating groups well. What advice, what might you have that I can specifically latch onto and work with to improve that area of my own practice and my own development? And then the same thing, we'll come back, get some things down in the chat, and we'll follow up a little bit with that as well. All right, so hopefully it's clear what I'm asking you to do, similar to what I asked you to do before. And Nicola, if we could go ahead and get into those breakout groups, that'd be great. I was looking over the chat of the qualities while you all were in the small groups, and a comment somebody had was that they all seem to be highly interconnected, all of the qualities, and I think that's probably true. And if I was to, and it's probably true with skills to a certain extent, if I was to focus on one area, it probably has an influence and boosts up, another area that I might not necessarily have my eye on in the moment. But I think that's right. They are interconnected. You can make the argument that they're arguably even the same thing. And so also make the argument that what is a quality versus a skill, and what's, how is it really that different? But that's all for another time. So I wanted to ask, great. So thanks for getting some of that stuff in there. Let's have, yeah, I see that. How about the explicit versus implicit folks? I guess it's Jason and his group. Folks want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the thing that enlivened our conversation mostly was the problem trying to coach a team online, because you know, in a room to a certain extent you can see people's movements. I mean, even there it's tricky, but in a online, people can be as explicit as they like and actually send messages to each other. They go, "What a load of rubbish! Are you getting this?" So it's not even to a certain extent implicit or explicit, or trying to be able to pick that up. And something that Alison pointed out as well is that a lot of teams, as they're particularly close, they have their own body language as well that often might be just the tells. Now, one thing we suggested maybe was that you have to be quite careful with the contracting at the start and saying, look, we will call specific observable behaviors. So for instance, if you're on saying, oh, I noticed you were quite defensive when you said that. No, what you can say though is, I noticed when you spoke there, you folded your arms. Was that which wasn't necessarily in keeping with what you were saying? Was that looked a little defensive or whatever? Was that what you meant? So you have to be probably quite explicit about what you say you're going to be looking for as well. And also, if someone has an implicit communication, how comfortable are you if they call it? Because often people's little asides are partly an aside because they don't want people to see it. So again, as Alison said, it's really important to make sure you've got it within the contracting at the start, that yes, if you pick things up, you'll call them. Bit of gestalt, really.
Great, thanks, Jason. And by the way, sneak peek, contracting is one of the skills that's listed. It just wasn't in the top 4, so you haven't seen that quite yet. But it will come up, because I will share the slides that just have all 14 qualities and all 11 of the skills, so you can see what those are. Great. You know, it looks like folks are still entering stuff in, which is great. Let me just see if there's another individual that is excited to kind of share a little bit of what their small group discussion was around skills. Anybody? I can't see anybody that's wanting to, and that's fine. Let's do this. I know we only have a few more minutes, so I want to bring up the next slide, Nicola, is kind of a quote, which I found interesting from the research. So I wanted to highlight it. And essentially, I mean, I'll just read it out. So an early mentor once told me that the best facilitators are the ones that the group does not remember. They do not remember the facilitator. They remember the work that the team did. This can be true for an individual coach too, but I think it is really specific for team coaches. If they remember me too much, then I was too much into their process. They need to remember the work that they did. So this particular team coach, I remember him saying, it's like when it works, it's almost like magic, right? And it works best when I am not in the middle of it all, right? And in fact, it works best when the team arguably doesn't even know that I'm there. Like, so in other words, my influence is very subtle for team coaching. The reason why I wanted to point that out and bring that out is because I think that it's an interesting observation. It's an interesting experience, particularly when you think about it in the context of you potentially as an individual team coach trying to, in effect, sell your services and how great you are as a team coach. Arguably, the team that is being coached best doesn't necessarily attribute it to you. So it's an interesting sort of like, okay, like, or, you know, the other way to think about it as well is somebody that maybe has a really big ego and needs to be in the center of everything all the time. Team coaching might not necessarily be the area that they want to spend a lot of their time in, because those that do it really well, at least according to this individual, and this might be true for you and your thoughts as well, are much more subtle than that. They don't place themselves in the middle of everything. So I just wanted to throw that up there just as an interesting thought. I just wanted to see if anybody had any reaction or thoughts to those ideas at all.
I think it points to the importance of empathy.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, it's a little like the business of not making it about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I guess, skills in making it about the other is being empathetic.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So, go ahead.
I'm not sure I'd agree with the statement entirely.
Okay, great.
I've just literally, before I came on here, finished coaching a client I've been working with over a couple of years now, and probably the best thing he ever says to me is, "That really made me think." But when I ask him about it afterwards, he'll always say, "You made me think."
Mm.
So, and I don't think that you can separate those two things. So if you were totally transparent as a team coach, I think that would be taking it too far.
Mm.
But you don't need to be seen as the leader, would be the way I'd think of it.
Mm. Yeah. Not being in the middle of it all, but having that influence.
Yes, influence, that's a great word, yeah.
Marius?
Yeah, I've just got a thought here. I come from a sporting background, and it's interesting that a guy called Sam Walker has written a book, The Hidden Forces that create the world's best teams. He's looking at it from a sporting angle, and it's called Captain Class. That's the title of the book. And so in all the top teams that he picked out, the elite teams in the world in different sports, football, rugby, hockey, etc., the thing that sustained over time was the captain and not the coach, which is kind of, it's a weird angle too, but you know, like the All Blacks from New Zealand, the American female football soccer team. One thing that held in the time when they're successful was the, and so I think if you look at that point, that where maybe the coach is a bit more in the background, then that might make sense. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure about you know, that statement, if you can take it too literally or not.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Let's move on to Nicola, if you could, the next slide. So folks, this is just, you know, this is just it. Like, this is the 14 in order of the qualities that came out of that research study. So you can kind of see those. And again, these are available as recorded. And I think the slides were actually included in the chat as a link as well. But you can kind of see, look at those, see what's coming up. And then the last one, the last slide is the skills. So again, the 11 skills that came out. And then if we move on to that next slide, you can see contracting being one of those, number 9. And of course, these are just listed here. And you know, if you want to take a deeper dive into what these things mean, the chapter, the book chapter has more detail into that. It's probably a much more easy way to look into this stuff if you're interested in more than accessing my entire PhD dissertation, which, although has a lot of additional items in there as well that might not be as interesting. But you know, if you're looking for literature review and things like that from 6 years ago, that's in there as well. So I know we're over time for a couple minutes, so I want to thank everybody for your participation. I'm hopeful that your small groups were fruitful. It looked like, based on what I was seeing in the chat, that they were. So I appreciate you all, your willingness to really like look at some research results and say, hey, what are some strategies that we can identify that might help somebody or ourselves develop further in any of these areas. I see Nicholas put up here the team coaching standards from EMCC, which Mary had mentioned at the outset, recently published, recently developed. Mary, do you want to say anything, or Nicola, anything about, or Colm, anything about these coaching standards?
So these 12 standards, they're fairly broad, but they were developed after an extensive consultation period led by Cole Murphy and my colleague Julie Haddock Miller. And so they've had a lot of input from EMCC members through various conferences and networks to come up with these 12. There may be some debate around particular individual elements of these standards, but I'm now working with a team of EMCC trusted providers. That is people who are teaching and delivering programs at level 7, which is master's level coaching, and who have experience of practitioner team coaching programs. And what we're busy doing, and we're almost there, and I think we will be there probably by the end of January, mid-February, is putting in the detail behind each of these standards. It's what we call performance indicators. So unlike competence, standards are not fixed. There is room for interpretation. So we are working up to, as it were, a date that will be flagged up in the not too distant future, where we can say we are now ready to start accrediting programs that people and organisations may be delivering, and signing off individual team coaching. We've already done some work with W. Beck's and with David Clutterbuck's programs, and that includes foundation and practitioner standards. And we're working with some of the other providers on their master's programs to look at their programs for accreditation. But I think what we heard from Bill tonight, there's quite a few of these standards that come into play, quite a lot, as you can see, down the bottom end around self-development, but also that idea of thinking systemically and understanding the context, the multi-stakeholder context, contracting and group dynamics that coaching, team coaching covers.